Welcome. So I'm Robert Dujarric. We're in Japan, so we always start on time. So I'm extremely happy that Grant has kindly agreed to give a presentation. Are you speaking on the record or off the record? Off. Off. So he's off the record. So if you want to quote him, ask him afterwards, and he will make sure that you're not misquoting him. And so without further ado, you can hear him, not me. Grant, the floor is yours. We'll have about 30 minutes of presentation, followed by a Q&A.
Okay, thank you for coming. I see at least a few people in here who know more about the topic than I do. So I will...
Mike, if you could speak close to the mic.
Okay, goodness, I'd like to move around if I can, but I'll stay here. Unless I have to. Just can't help it. But I have a unique ability to, in like 10 minutes, offend half the room. And within the next 10, the other half will probably be offended as well. That's one of the reasons I would like this off the record. But what I'm going to talk about is the three main things. One is the Japanese Defense Guidelines and National Security Strategy, which was announced in December. And then I will give some comments on how I see the US-Japan defense relationship, and then lead into the regional situation. I'd like to take about 30 minutes or so and try to run through this. And once again, these are my personal impressions of the topic. It's not the last word on it, and it's certainly not an official statement from anyone I'm associated with or have been affiliated with. But I just wanted to explain an interesting subject. What I start off with is to try to, another thing is, I'm not going to use PowerPoint, because people used to be interesting without PowerPoint. And so this is my challenge here, to be interesting without it. But I do have pictures, because I like looking at pictures. So I'll start with a short video, just to sort of warm up the audience. Okay, now I'm about 57 now, so when I was about 10, you had 40-year-old men who had, half of them had fought the Japanese. So I grew up looking at that Japanese flag and thinking, oh boy, watch McHale's Navy, and so I had the enemy. But I look at it now, and I think that is great, to actually see that, and think these are our allies. One never knows how things will turn out. Now first, let me talk about these guidelines that were put out in December. Now these were actually sensible. They were very well written. I think in some ways they were clearer than what the Americans put out. They properly shift the focus of Japan's defense south as opposed to up north in Hokkaido. It calls for a kind of capability that Japan needs if you look at the operating environment, which is an amphibious capability, and which also requires a joint capability. And when I say joint, I mean you have the Rikkaiku, the air, sea, and the army, Japanese Army, Navy, and Air Force cooperating together. Additionally, the guidelines call for better communications. This is in a technical sense. And this is a fundamental problem that has been overlooked. Additionally, it calls for the JSDF to play a more regional role, and almost a diplomatic role, to get out of just Japan and start doing more in the region. These were all sensible ideas. I would note that the previous NDPG were actually pretty good too. So it isn't as though these just suddenly came out of the blue, but there's been Japanese thinking about these for a long time, and the previous version was pretty good. But they forgot one thing. There's one glaring weakness. Can someone tell me what that is? They forgot to pay for it. There's no money. The supposed defense increase is a smoke and mirrors thing. It's nothing of the sort. What you will have is after about 5 years, they will be up at about where the rate of the defense spending was in about 2002. This is not an increase in defense spending. And if you don't do that, you've got problems. No matter how good your guidelines are, you create a lot of resentment, for one thing, amongst the three services. Imagine yourself if you're on a boat, your ship is sunk and you're on a small boat with 2 other people. After a couple of days, the other people start to look pretty delicious. And that's what you have. The U.S. is doing the same thing right now. We have the U.S. Navy and the Air Force trying to convince people they alone can win a war with China and therefore need all the money. We have the Army figuring, well, we got to get in on this too, so we'll turn ourselves into a Marine Corps and do their job. So the point is that when the money's not there, that people start to turn on each other. You're getting a cannibalization which takes place. Also, I'll say this is resentment builds up, unfortunately, which inhibits this jointness that I talked about. You've got to have the 3 services cooperate. Japan is fairly new at this. In our case, it took Senator Goldwater, who was a scary guy, to force the Pentagon to do it. But Japan must have this jointness. And give you a very simple example. You have the 3 services. Now, try to pick up this bottle with 1 finger. You can't do it. Try it with 2. Well, you kind of can. But when you use 3, it works better. I mean, this is incredibly commonsensical. But it's surprising how hard it is to get military services run by adults to cooperate. But this is a fundamental requirement. If you don't have the money, your chances of cooperation are decreased proportionately. Additionally, the guidelines actually call for the JSDF to buy 17 V-22 Osprey, the tilt-rotor aircraft. The Osprey is a good piece of gear. It's really expensive. And the guidelines forgot to give the JSDF the money to pay for these things, the money to operate them. So you have what is already too small a budget, and you're saying, well, here, we're going to give you these 15 Ferraris. Take care of them, but I don't have the money for them. So you've got to have the money to make this work. A couple of years ago, the Japanese government actually gave the Japanese Navy several submarines. But once again, without the money to pay for it, to pay for crews, to do the training. It's a fundamental requirement. So without the money, you end up with a stunted development. The JSDF simply does not develop the way it should. And say this is a fundamental problem that in much of the commentary over the guidelines, it doesn't seem to have been, it doesn't get much of the attention, which is a little bit puzzling. And this points out another aspect of Japan's defense policy is it's the overwhelming influence of what used to be called Ministry of Finance. You pretty much have Ministry of Finance bureaucrats having much too much decisive influence over what Japan's defense is going to look like. I'm not sure exactly what kind of school you go to become a bureaucrat, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't involve studying military very much. And you have this problem. Now, the JSDF knows very well what sorts of things they need. But it's amazing just how often they are not consulted, or if they are, they're just overlooked as just being uniformed people. And that is, once again, a fundamental problem that the guidelines have pointed out. This is why you end up with ships that are pretty good, but they're missing things. We would, for example, an amphibious ship without a well deck. You've got this giant ship that holds 4 helicopters, and maybe you can squeeze 2 other inside. It's very inefficient use of a ship. So you get these decisions that are made by people who are not qualified too often. and they do not make use of it, the expertise which is available. There's also, so ultimately, though it is, as I see it, a lack of political will to spend more money. As the money exists, you know, it's there, but the GOJ apparently simply sees no need to spend more money. And I suspect that the only way that they will spring loose is once they are more afraid of the US government than they are of the Ministry of Finance. Will take, I think, Gaiatsu to actually spring for more money. Another thing I would point out, since I'm on talk about the guidelines, is the new National Security Council which has been established. You know, once again, there's a couple things that one notes is that it kind of depends on what the National Security Council is going to do and who's on it. I would point out that just having a National Security Council does not solve your problems. We've had a National Security Council for years, and it's gotten us success in Afghanistan, success in Iraq, success in Vietnam, one thing after another. And I'm not being glib or trying to be too funny about it, but the fact just setting up an NSC on its own is not necessarily a huge accomplishment. It's what it's actually going to do, and that very much remains to be seen. Now, I've just, not too long ago, I finished spending 2.5 years with the Japanese Army. Every day, that's who I was with. It was great. Since I was the Marine liaison to the Japanese Army, I was the first one in 65 years, which means they never had one, if you can believe that. So we were a little bit late. I also saw this not just as the Army, because Marines are kind of a hybrid. We don't swim that well, so we're tied in with the Navy. And so I made a real effort to get to know the NSDF and have a real appreciation for them. And, and the ASDF as well, oddly enough. And so I just would like to make some comments on that, on what I see their capabilities. They're actually good. The NSDF is probably the farthest along within limits. And there's actually a reason for that, which is kind of, well, I'll get to that later if I don't forget. But the NSDF is probably farthest along. Once again, I'll go back to the main problem they've got is called stovepiping, or this lack of joint capability. When I first started, I remember I told a JSDF officer, I said, well, I know the Navy hasn't liked you for I said like 65 years. And he goes, oh no, it goes back 120 years. And you would hear this stuff. I had an occasion to talk to the head of the Japanese Army, and I gave him my pitch, full of self-righteousness of what they need to do. And I was, of course, completely correct. But he stopped me in the middle. He says, but the Navy won't talk to us. And I said, well, leave that up to us. And then you get to the Navy, and they say, well, the Japanese Army doesn't want to talk to us. But there were people on both sides who understood what needed to be done, and there was plenty of cooperation going on. But in a very general sense, there is this UCLA, USC kind of animosity that you would have, but tenfold. But that is still a huge problem. It's getting to be less of a problem quicker than one might think, but it's still a serious consideration. Another problem is that they've got is lack of communications. And this isn't communications in the the new age self-improvement sense. This is picking up a radio and being able to talk to somebody, both to talk to each other, both Navy, Air Force, and Army, to be able to talk to each other, and also to be talked to the Americans. We are the allies, after all, and we're supposed to operate together. You have to be able to do this. You got to be able to do it smoothly. I remember seeing on San Clemente Island off Southern California a couple of years ago, a Japanese general was looking at our command and control center, and I heard him say in Japanese to his manservant, he said, it's translated as, well, this is really good, but if we had it, we would only be able to talk to ourselves. And the point is that this needs to be fixed. But the thing is, it's not hard. There's some regulations which need to be changed, but that's easy. And I'm convinced that in the three services, you could take the communications officers or whoever's in charge, give them a credit card, and send them to big camera, and within an afternoon they would have the technical problems worked out. But it is a fundamental problem if you want to develop the joint cooperative capability. Now sometimes one hears, well, the JSDF hasn't had combat experience since 1945. This doesn't matter. They will do just fine. If you train well and you're otherwise organized properly and equipped properly, you'll do okay. It's not often realized that in 2001, the American military hadn't exactly been in a bloodbath since Vietnam. There was the Gulf War interlude, but that was, the total casualties were about the first 30 seconds on Tarawa. But if you train well, the lack of combat experience is not an issue. There's also a concern which sometimes hinders, it comes up in the debate over the JSDF, and that's I call the offensive taboo. And if you remember back a few years, if anyone had ever mentioned the word offensive, they'd have practically been skinned alive. But this is a concept which most people do not think through it as to what it actually means. And there's offensive operations within the context of a strategic offense, and offensive operations within the context of a strategic defense. A strategic offense is invading Manchuria. Strategic defense is protecting your own territory. There's something commonsensical about the ability to attack and counterattack when conducting military operations. For a long time, there was an idea that, well, defense means you dig a hole and you wait for the enemy to come and you try to shoot him until you eventually die. So think through this. It's an issue that really only takes about a minute for most people to realize what the shortcomings are. I would ask, what weapon is purely defensive or purely offensive? It depends on how you use it. Like this, I have a pen somewhere. Well, this could be an offensive weapon. It could be a defensive weapon. And once again, so you hear people talk about offensive weapons or defensive weapons, and could you explain yourself better, please? This is, once again, something which is taken as a truth, but it's never been given much thought. Additionally, there's an idea that somehow the JSDF in Japan will be a threat to their neighbors. And you hear the neighbors, two of the main neighbors say this all the time, one of them in particular. One really needs to do the math. In order for Japan to be a threat to anybody, they would have to increase the JSDF in size by at least 3 times. With a shrinking population, I'm not sure where they're going to find the young people, assuming they could even do that. As they have trouble even paying for the existing JSDF. Do you think they would increase expenditures 10 times over? Probably not. Also, what does it take to actually put a sizable combat force overseas? What does it take? How many ships? How many people does it require? Think through that. How many does it take to keep them there and then to do something? Japan, even in their wildest dreams, could not be a threat to anyone. Just as I talked a little bit about the guidelines and my take on some comments about the JSDF, but it's surprising. They're actually pretty good. Now, I want to tell a story. My particular role when I got the job was a little bit vague. Was kind of to go do something useful. You're the first Marine, so be useful. And so what you looked at when you thought about it, and I had known this for a long time, when you look at a map of Japan and you see islands, you realize they need to be able to operate in a place with islands and ocean, a mixture of land and sea. So I thought, well, they could use an amphibious capability. But what had really driven that home was March 11, the tsunami. Because I went to Sendai fairly quickly after that. And what you saw is that had Japan had an amphibious capability, they would have saved about 3,000 or 4,000 lives. Instead, they let them freeze to death in the first 24 hours because of this offensive taboo. This concern about Japan not being able to control itself. I'm being a little mean here, but they let them die. The Japanese Navy got up to Tohoku very quickly, and say a kilometer offshore, but they might as well have been 10,000 kilometers offshore because they didn't have the equipment and the hardware to get from ship to shore efficiently and do relief work, nor did they have the know-how how to do those operations. And that's what comes of 60 years of stunted growth. But what you saw up there was the need for, you saw the opportunity of what Japan could do if they had the capability. In addition to defending their territory better, from a humanitarian assistance capability, you've got, if you want to save your people, you got to have this. So I took a look at what I thought Japan needed to do and what I thought what they already had. And you looked at it, they had about 80% of the hardware that you need to conduct amphibious operations. Actually 90% if you consider how you might handle the air capability, the air requirement. But they had zero of the know-how, the software. And that was okay because we had it. We learned the hard way along with the Navy, and we'd give it to them for free. But they had most of what they needed. And there were also some what you found is within the JSDF that there were officers who, you would call them reformers or revolutionaries, who understood exactly what was necessary and had tried as much as they could to do something. So there was a lot, the timing was good, there was a lot to work with. And so what we did was we, in a sort of ad hoc kind of way, we brought JSDF down to Okinawa, down to Sasebo, to see how an amphibious force is constructed. We were able to do the Iron Fist exercise in Southern California, which has been going on for 2006, and to get the Navy, Japanese Navy, to send somebody an account to it. And that was a good thing. And then there was actually something done in Guam for the first, just a few months after that, where the Japanese sent a platoon down. They put them on a US Navy ship in Okinawa, sailed down to Guam, and did an exercise with the US Marines. This was kind of poo-pooed in a way because it was only a platoon. But the precedent that this set was immensely important. And the fact that they got on the ships at Okinawa with nobody complaining at all, was a historic event. In fact, we also finally, we made the front page of Newsweek after that exercise. I think you actually wrote the thing, didn't you? But when you see this, you're getting the idea into the public realm. And that was a success. And we went on to another Iron Fist, and went pretty well. And then finally, we did Dawn Blitz. Dawn Blitz was an exercise last June off of Southern California, where the Japanese Navy sent 3 ships, 2 of them amphibious ships, from Japan. They put on JSDF, Japanese Army helicopters, from Tokyo and with their crews. And then in Hawaii, they picked up several hundred more JSDF. And this probably hadn't happened since 1942 or so. But it was you got them to get together, you're demonstrating jointness, you're getting them on ships working together. They sailed to Southern California, and they demonstrated that in very short order that Japan had an amphibious capability. They had, if you think about it, went across the ocean, got themselves organized, did a good landing operation on an island off of Southern California, came back onto the ships. A week later, did another landing exercise on Camp Pendleton, and did it very smoothly. Nobody got hurt. They had no accidents. So the Japanese Army pilots were flying off of Japanese Navy ships like they had been doing it forever. They really did a good job. They did a very good fire support exercise on one of the islands with complicated sort of stuff, and they really did it well. If you could, I'm going to show some pictures. Because I heard once that you can only talk for 12 minutes before people stop listening. So I'm going to show you some pictures. This is most of the, if we could turn the lights on, please, it'd be a little easier to see. And just, if you could take 3 seconds, well, okay, this is one of the Japanese amphibious ships leaving Pearl Harbor. It has JSDF equipment on it. And these people, of course, hate each other, but they hate each other less now. They Okay. That's the Hugo. That's another amphibious ship. This is the one where the Ministry of Finance bureaucrats forgot to put in a well deck so that you can bring amphibious vehicles into it. It should go right here, but they seem to have overlooked it. Next, please. Now this is a U.S. Marine Osprey landing on the Hugo off of Southern California. Once again, history being made. And all these things were thought impossible 3 years ago. Next, please. Once again, an Apache, that's an attack helicopter and a transport helicopter. JSDF and MSDF working together. Next, please. Same thing. Next, please. Next. Next. Now you're just seeing this. This is the visual proof of what actually happened. But it was, so once you saw it, it was done so well that I don't know of any other people on Earth that could have pulled this off with so little practice. Next. This is a U.S. amphibious ship, the Boxer, just across the way, taken from the Hugo. And it shows what is capable, what you can do if you can combine U.S. and Japanese capabilities. Next, please. Next, this is the Atago Japanese ship that fired about 260 rounds in a one-day fire exercise. And our Navy liaison officer on there said, we would have broken the gun about 5 times. The Japanese fired it without a malfunction. Next, please. Next. Next, so you're getting used to operating in a sort of island environment. And this is actually where the fire support exercise was being done. So you had an Apache coming onto the Hugo, loading up, refueling, going in, and doing firing runs, whilst the Atago is firing from this direction, and mortars are coming in here. This is actually very complicated, hard to do. The Japanese did it extremely well. One might point out that if you could do it in Southern California, you could probably do it in the Nansei Shoto if you had to. Next, please. And this, once again, is empirical evidence of what happened. You can put the JSDF, the MSDF, and the Japanese Air Force like within proximity, and they do not claw at each other. Next, please. And what's in the Marines and the U.S. Navy were in on this training exercise just as much as you think we would be. And it is that, we say we're glad to share the software, the know-how. Next. Next, please. Next. 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 Okay, once again, you can see what the JSDF can do. You're combining your air capability with your ground, and they came off of a Japanese ship. Pretty good. Next, please. This is one of the missing pieces in the whole Japanese, this is one of the main hardware pieces that's missing. It is that ship-to-shore connector. It's an amphibious vehicle. And this is what, if they had had this in Sendai, you could have saved, this would have been playing the main role in saving lives, had they had it. It's a shame they didn't, but the JSDF is procuring these. These are really inexpensive, but there's more to it than that. This comes from, say, this ship. It comes out of their lands. In order to operate this, what do you have to do? You have to have the Navy and the Army cooperate. So it's rare that a $4 million piece of metal has that strategic effect of breaking down the barriers between the Japanese services. Next, please. And you saw a little bit of that one. And next. Next. Okay. And this presumably is a view somebody might see if they were to seize a Japanese island. There's a third ship that's over the horizon that I couldn't get in there. Next, please. Once again, the U.S. Navy Admiral didn't show up, but as you can see, we've got the Marine in here. Next, please. And there's even a Canadian in here somewhere, though the exercise was not specifically for that. Next, please. Next. Next. And this is The previous one, that's a Japanese Navy admiral, Japanese general walking together. There's a symbolism to it all. But this is the one I was talking about at the beginning. To see that flag and to be under it, it's actually kind of a very interesting feeling. You know, I wouldn't have thought that would have ever been the case, but we're glad we could do it. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Okay. Okay, and the last point I want to make is to give you a sense of the relative advanced development of Japan's amphibious capability. Is about 4 years ago, the Australians seriously set about developing an amphibious capability. And they've gone about here. And then about a little over 2 years ago, the Japanese started. And the Japanese are now somewhere by that window. That is how fast they have gone. And part of the reason, I won't explain why, is because they did it. They didn't do it like the Marines would have done it. They'd still be talking about it if they'd done it that way. But they've really gone quite a ways. Now what I'm going to talk about is the US-Japan relationship. And I've noticed actually that I came looking through my notes that I said something very similar about 9 years ago at a Benkyokai, a study group between US and Japanese sort of young people. I was never invited back, but I said almost the exact same thing. Now you've heard the expression that this is the most important bilateral relationship bar none. And you just hear this. It's like a mantra outside a Buddhist temple. But yeah, maybe it is. But if you saying it doesn't make it true. And then you always hear, well, it's never been stronger. It seems like it's always never been stronger. Once again, I don't know. I'm not convinced of that. I wasn't 9 years ago, and I'm not so sure now. But Operation Tomodachi, for all of these never been stronger sort of statements, what you saw is after 60 years, the Japanese military was really unable to conduct joint operations. 60 years. And they really were not able to operate with us. And this is, except for the two navies. The navies are the exception. And they have got a very good relationship that shows what can be done. And this should be really should be the model. So you even had up in Tomodachi, the Japanese Army general, who was the Joint Task Force commander, didn't really know what the Japanese Navy was doing. They were up doing things, but he didn't know what they were doing. That's not how you do joint operations. In fact, I would have suggested that the security relationship was until fairly recently, actually was fundamentally weak. And I would suggest that this was partly because it was wildly imbalanced, with the US basically saying, we're the ones who are going to die. And you don't really have to do anything, just give us some real estate and a few $1 billion a year, which is about the fraud in a single construction project. It's not a whole lot of money. It kind of reminded you, if you remember those old black and white 1950s movies where there'd be some tough guy, he'd say, baby, don't worry your pretty little head, I'll be doing the thinking for both of us. And that's kind of how we were. You guys just shut up, Japan, just go sit in the corner. And that is isn't going to work very well. The Japanese were very good. If you saw those movies as well, there'd be some girl, some hot dame who would say, "Ooh, you have such big muscles." And the guy goes, "Yeah, baby, you're right." Start rolling out $100 bills. And that's how the Japanese were playing us. And I don't really see that as that sort of pathological dependence as a particularly strong basis for a bilateral relationship, much less personal relationships. Japan was getting $50 to $100 billion in free defense every year for decades. And that's money you don't spend on something else. You're getting the services of the world's most powerful military for, once again, the amount of fraud in a single construction project. For nothing at all. Call up Lloyd's of London and say, we like the coverage the Americans give us. What's it going to cost us? Once the guy stops laughing and thinks about it, say, well, 50 to 100 billion a year. That was a really good deal, and one really has to hand it to the Japanese. If you got a good deal like that, you can keep it going. That's no small feat. However, over time, this is not, it can't continue. And I would note that for a few years now, this has not been a vote getter in Washington, D.C. And you can imagine China's white lobbyists, Walmart and the lead, trotting up to Capitol Hill, should push come to shove, and saying, these people think that they can just call you up the way you would call a taxi outside the Mayflower Hotel and you'll go die for them. And that would resonate even with me. And the point of this is that imbalanced relationship was unhealthy and couldn't, really just could not continue. So there's this urgent need for something more equal. And this is to upgrade the JSDF, to give them the capability so that the JSDF can defend Japan. But in the same time, when you upgrade the quality, the capabilities, you've actually made them a really useful ally. Once again, like the two navies. And you do that, and I think you have fundamentally strengthened the relationship. But it was something that really until a few years ago, it was out of whack. And there was this need for equality. What do we get from a capable JSDF? It's just an incredible payoff. It's 2 or 3 divisions. You get a very good Navy, a pretty big one, a very good Air Force. You get 2 or 3, the equivalent of Marine Expeditionary Units. And since America appears to be running out of money, we're shrinking. Japanese can fill up a lot of the void. Plus, you put these 2 strong democracies together, the 2 forced services together, and look at it from the PRC's perspective. The way it was, you had this, the US doing something, the Japanese doing something, kind of independent of each other. And that's pretty easy to split politically. It's not hard at all. I think if you know how power and influence works in Washington, it's not hard to split that. But if you can make it more of a real ally that can operate together, then you've got this to face. And that is a much harder thing to split. And that is, it's going to be a tough nut to crack. Also, in terms of regional stability, there's a knock-on effect to this, is that except for China, I'd say that most of Asia, there is a real desire to see a more capable, or at least an acceptance of a capable Japanese military, particularly linked up with the Americans. There's certainly people deciding whether they're going to hedge their bets or not. I'm just about at the end here. There's some things that I would say should be done. And these would be the recommendations if someone asked me what I thought they should do. And the one is, for Japan needs to do the following. It's got to pay more money. I would say about $5 to $10 billion a year for about 5 years. That would get them to about where they need to go. That's a rough calculation. And I know Robert's done immense work on this, so he would tell me I'm all wrong. But you'd be in the ballpark if you spent that much money. One might note that Ronald Reagan, when he started improving the US military after the disaster of the 70s, he had some great ideas, but if he hadn't spent the money, nothing would have happened. Additionally, the Japanese central government needs to speak up and explain what is needed defense-wise, what is required for national defense. Up till now, the MO, the way of doing things, has pretty much been to hope nobody notices. They do things, but hope nobody sees. Additionally, it's probably a good idea to stop complaining so much and say how hard everything is, how difficult it is, even if it works with US diplomats. It appeared that all you had to say was, well, this is really hard, and we've got an election coming. Could you help us out just this one time? Well, there's always an election coming. But it worked for decades. Once you stop complaining, Article 9, and this is, I'm sure, going to infuriate the other half of the room, it's been interpreted out of any possible original meaning from about 1950. It pretty much serves as a very good excuse not to not to do something. If there's something Japan doesn't want to do, you say, well, Article 9 won't let us do it. But look at what they do. Look at what they have and compare that to the words of Article 9. It doesn't make sense. What the US needs to do is to treat Japan like an equal, like we used to do with the British before Britain decided they didn't want a military. But they say you've got to treat them like an equal. There's some sense that somehow the Japanese are not quite trustworthy, that if you give them guns, if you give them capability, they'll run amok. They just won't be able to control themselves. And what this reminds me of is the old South Africa and the apartheid era. The Afrikaners used to say, I tell you men, these blacks, they don't understand democracy. They don't want it. They don't like it. And that's kind of what people are saying about the Japanese. They're this unique race of people that if they have guns, they will just be unable to control themselves. And if there's ever been a more responsible country for the last 70 years, I've never heard of who it is. It's Japan. We've got to get out over this. There's also an excessive fear that whatever we do is going to provoke the Chinese. Name one thing that Japan could do which is not going to provoke the Chinese. And also there's fear the rest of Asia is worried about Japanese militarism. Depends on which part of Asia you're talking about. China is to some degree, but go from India, Indonesia, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, they all are pretty well disposed towards Japan. We might do well also to stop appeasement. If you look at what happened in the 1930s, look at what's happening today, look what was tried, or if we can just get to know these people, if we just get to understand their concerns and address them, well, everything will be fine. It didn't work all that well back then. Additionally, fully link up, and going back to my original one, is treat the Japanese like equals, fully link up with them, do joint planning together, joint development, joint operations. And my last thing here is that part of the reason I think that the two navies are so equal is because in the 50s, Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was the head of the Navy, who was responsible, he'd been in the middle of the fighting back in World War II, he said, these people were our enemies, but now they're our allies, period. And we're going to treat them that way. And you see the results of what came from that. So that is the end of my pitch. I'm glad to take questions. So to summarize, defense guidelines, very good. They need more money. The US-Japan relationship, it needs to get more balanced. And there needs to be more effort on the Japanese side, more equality, certainly, period. And regionally, if you can do that, then you will actually it'll be a stabilizing force. I think if 30 showed us anything, it's that when democratic countries or free countries will stand up for themselves, it tends to do more to preserve peace than anything else. So that's it. And I'd be glad to answer questions for the people who aren't offended yet.
Thank you very much. So only those who haven't been offended can ask questions. Ira, you will get
Thanks. I have two comments and one question. I just finished reading Robert Gates' memoir, and quite frankly, your description of the structural problems inside the self-defense force is almost identical to his description of his problems during his tenure. I mean, a very interesting reflection. I'm not sure how much of what your description is unique to Japan as compared to unique to the military psychology. Thank you for nodding for that. The other comment and my question is 35 years ago, in the late 70s, there was an effort to increase the budget, as you know, of Japan, the military budget. And during the Nakasone days, the critical decision was made to go over the 1% GDP threshold. That lasted for a few years, and we haven't been there for 30 years. Why would one expect that there would be any change into the future? I mean, quite frankly, much of what you say is simply wishful thinking. I mean, it's the stuff that people have been talking about for 25 years, and I suspect we'll be talking about for the next 25. So can you convince us in 2 minutes that there are fundamental changes going on in Japan which will lead to a 1.2% GDP expenditure on defense?
This is how I would make the argument. You know, and I understand it's something that, yeah, let's see it. You know, it's you know, we've heard all sort of like, you know, this piece around the corner in North Korea. It's let's see it. What I would suggest is that somebody who, say, went to sleep or who just knew nothing about Japan from 4 years ago, came back today and looked at the way that the JSDF has progressed. And I would cite amphibious capability as an example. We'd say this couldn't possibly have happened. I had guys that I think who know more about this than me, an Australian in particular, who I talked about all this. He said this couldn't happen. And well, it has happened. You look at what can be done when there's a need to do it, and there's an opportunity to do it, and so I think this shows what is doable. But unless the U.S. government, I think, throws its weight around, I don't see the Japanese increasing defense spending. It's just too easy not to. I think politicians take the path of least resistance, and that's what they do. Look at us trying to control entitlement spending. Yeah, we could do it, but nobody wants to do it. And so it will take the United States to lay down the law and say, this is what you have to do, or else start studying Mandarin. And will that happen? I don't know. I would not be, I don't know how much money I would bet on it. Probably not much, but I wish they would. I think they would. I think it would probably, but if Tanaka Kakue was still alive, I think we'd have more success. Because as he told the U.S. at one point when they're bringing aircraft carrier, tell us what you need, and we'll take care of it. But too often the U.S. side, they anticipate what the problems are. They tell Japan what the problems are. So I think that when Japan is able to move very quickly when it has to, I think the development in the amphib capability is an example. And the progress that JSDF has had, where now one, it could defend itself, and two, it could be a useful ally, which it could not have been 3 or 4 years ago. The U.S. government has a role to play here if it chooses to recognize it. Hopefully it will, because we cannot succeed in, I don't think we can maintain our position in Asia without Japan, and Japan certainly cannot maintain its position without us. Hopefully somebody will wise up. Sometimes people come along unexpectedly. Additionally, I would note 35 years ago that nobody thought China was a problem. Everything was at best North Korea, and that was an American problem. To the extent Japanese thought about it was the Russians. So there's possibly, I think the circumstances have changed such that there is more an immediate threat to Japan that may have a sort of a stimulative effect. I would hope so. And I always remind myself that the Japanese are the guys that captured Singapore in 70 days. This hasn't been entirely extinguished, that, whatever you want to call it, but the capability. And I think it's there. And having seen it, say, day in and day out with the Japanese military, have some other experiences here that I would, I think it's possible, whereas 10 years ago, maybe impossible. Can't make a conclusive case, but I would be a little more optimistic than that. Yes.
Yes, hi, Lance Gatling. I'd point out to Ira that, in fact, the Japanese defense budget has been over 1% for a very long time. It's hard to compare apples to oranges because they park the personnel retirement costs in different budgets. Also, they have a penchant for putting things like the intelligence gathering satellites, space situational awareness, and maritime domain awareness in different budgets, and they're not going to show up in the Ministry of Defense, even though they might be in it would most likely be in the defense budgets of any other country in the world. But if you look at the real forcing function, it's the F-35. It's breaking the bank for everybody on the planet. I had a meeting with the Minister of Defense and asking specifically about procurement reform, and he said that they're being told by the Ministry of Finance to fix procurement. And earlier I've been told by Menti folks that they waste up to 30 to 40% of their procurement budget. $8 billion a year, that means they got an extra $3.2 to $5 billion US to spend if they fix procurement. That's just on capital items. That's not including all of the groceries and stuff they buy on the local bases, and it's rife with non-competitive factors, let's say. So there's a lot of money to slosh around, even without without busting the 1% GDP cap in a very large fashion, even though they could do that. As you say, it's background noise on any major public construction project. But if you go back to the Ministry of Defense, if you ask your folks that you work for, what do they want as a reasonable end state to all of this? Thank you.
What is
the self-defense forces, the folks, the officers that you deal with, what do they see as a reasonable, viable end state? And in the past, Japanese officers would tell me, we don't want to be first-class citizens in Japan. We ascribe to second-class citizenship, and they think they got that with Tomodachi. So what's next? What would they want to see in terms of jointness or capability to do something?
My sense is that they want to have a capable military that can operate jointly, effectively, and defend their country, rather than rely on the Americans to do it. Ultimately, that's it, and whatever it takes to do that is you need a GSDF, an MSDF, an ASDF that can operate together, have adequate equipment. They've got, the equipment isn't bad already, but that is what they want. And it's, you know, one of the really astonishing things is that just how little the Americans, say the US government actually knew about the people in the JSDF. If I had, say this, you know, I've had Japanese ask me, these are like old Japanese, well, what kind of people joined the GSDF? You know, if anyone has ever met a 19-year-old Jiekon from Tochigi, oh, I'd be surprised. And there's really very little understanding of what the Japanese military officers or enlisted are actually about. And they are just as committed to defending their own country as anyone else. But there was always the sense that somehow they're the third string, because it's Japan. And this is has not been well understood, but I think they want to be able to defend their country, not to rely on the Americans. But that is not to say they want to displace the Americans, but rather to have, once again, have that more equal relationship with the Japanese up front. And this little, the ironic, or sort of the humorous angle aspect of this is, when I first started what I was doing, there was someone asked, well, why are you guys doing this? And there was a very smart major, Marine major, who was helped me. He said, you know, because we want them to die instead of us. And ultimately, a nation's military, that's their job, is to defend the country. But they unfortunately have been humiliated and belittled for a good long while, and are just now getting the respect they deserve. You give them the opportunity, give them the permission, and those pictures I showed you, and show you what they're capable of. Operation Tomodachi, that was the American part of it. The JSDF response to the tsunami was just astonishing. The Americans get a lot of credit for whatever we did. What we did was like this much. The Japanese did 99.9%, and of that, 98% was done by the JSDF, and most of that was done by the GSDF. And that is not well understood. Had it not been for them, it would have been a god-awful mess. There would have been nothing the Japanese government could have done. But it was the GSDF, principally the JSDF, which took the lead up there. So they did get a lot of respect for that. They also, along with everyone else, got an 8.5% pay cut the same year. No good deed goes unrewarded. And so that's sort of a long-winded answer to your question. But they just want to be like what a regular military does. And I've had, it's interesting, especially if you get out beyond the Tokyo environment, you get up to the operating units, and you have these guys tell you that they, very clear language that they are the ones that are going to defend the country. Go hang out with the Western Army Infantry Regiment or the Special Boarding Unit. And these guys, and these are tough customers that could fit right into a sort of a Marine infantry unit. And there is the psychology is there of sort of good soldiers. Yes. Yes. Okay, sorry. Sorry.
Okay, my question is, if Japan and the United States are to be allies, can we not expect the Japanese to say, we want to do it, let us do it, or be more equal, as you say, in allies like this? Because the perception is the United States will do everything, or most things.
I think that you would see the JSDF playing in some cases, taking the lead, but within the U.S. playing a supporting role. And on balance, what you would want is something more like this. It would never be completely equal, most likely. But I think it's not unthinkable. It depends on the circumstances. Sometimes the JSDF would have the lead. Sometimes the Americans would. Partly depends on available resources, capabilities. If we have two other wars going on somewhere else at the same time, it depends. But I think it is more possible now, I think, than it's ever been. And once again, if you had gone to sleep 3 years ago, woke up today, you'd say, where is this place? Am I back in Texas or something? Where everybody likes to fight. Yes.
Narushige Michista from the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. I have 3 questions. First one is you talked about what's new. You said what's new in this new NDPG's increased size of the budget. But at the same time, we are facing the Abe administration have this inflation target, and also we are seeing depreciation of Japanese yen. So in terms of purchasing power, I don't know whether we have a net increase in defense capabilities or purchasing, increase in the defense capabilities. So what do you think about this? And the second one is you talked about offensive taboo, and I have a kind of same feeling. And we are procuring, as you said, amphibious landing vehicles and trying to acquire landing capabilities. But if we kind of limit the missions of amphibious, amphibious unit to kind of defensive operations, such as taking back some of the islands along the First Island chain or southwestern islands. I don't know how useful these acquiring amphibious landing capabilities might be, because the most important, amphibious possessing landing capabilities would have a tremendous strategic implications, because your enemy must be prepared to defend all the possible landing places in order to hedge against possible landing by your enemy. But if you are limiting yourself to just to land on some of the islands that you have, or those islands that belong to yourself, I don't know whether this is a cost-effective investment that we are making. So I would like to have your comments on this point. And the third one, you didn't necessarily talk about collective self-defense issue, but if we are to make it possible for us to exercise the right of collective self-defense, what kind of missions or new areas or new operations, new mission areas that you expect that we can conduct together, or engage in together, or just bilaterally, or possibly more broadly with not only in the US and Japan, but also with the Australian friends and the Southeast Asia countries.
Okay, the first part about the money, That is one that accountants can argue with all day, but you know when it's been increased. And by any measure, that the amounts required are not much. It's just not a whole lot of money. And once it is, this side, when I used to hear this all the time from Japanese officials in particular, saying they say our fiscal condition is so severe, you cannot afford you can't afford this. And this is telling the guy, oh, your muscles are so big, and it's so stupid. And it's idiotic to suggest the money doesn't exist. It's there. What is required is not much. The amphibious capability, it lets you do a number of things, and you're not using it just for one possible contingency, but you can do a range of things. You can do humanitarian, HADR, disaster relief operations anywhere in Japan. You can do it in Southeast Asia. We put together a Japanese view, a combination of Navy ships and JSDF and ASDF capability. And this could go throughout Southeast Asia, responding to the kinds of events that Marines on Okinawa and the Navy respond to several times a year. You could do it with the Americans, you could do it independently. There's a political benefit to all of this, in addition to the pure humanitarian aspect, and you saw this on display already in the Philippines a few months ago. The JSDF at the drop of a hat, stopped what they were doing, put together an amphibious task force, went to the Philippines, showed up when it still made a difference. And once again, this was thought impossible. And no other people could have done this. I like the Australians. I wish there were 10 times more of them. But they've left the Japanese have really done well.
But my question is actually not about disaster relief. I'm asking you whether, militarily speaking, let's limit our discussion to military operations. Would it be useful and what invested?
Yes. For one, first thing, these don't cost much. The cost of AAVs is inconsequential, just nothing. And cost is a secondary. It's not even, in this case, it's not even an issue, but it should always be a secondary requirement. It's what do you need to do to defend your country? You want to have a toolbox full of every tool you might need. These particular vehicles give you a useful tool. It expands the range of events you can respond to and the ways you can respond. And that ultimately leads to a more efficient result. And it often saves lives if done right. So from a military standpoint, so you want everything you can have. And there is definitely a role for this. You'll notice the Chinese Marines, the Chinese amphibious forces have plenty of these things.
Yeah, but the point is, they are willing to occupy or land on enemy territories. We are not, or we might not decide to do it.
Well, I don't think Japan has any intention of landing on anybody's territory.
I know. So
but if someone lands on yours, you want to be able to take it back. If you don't have this, you will limit your options to respond.
You go back to your numbers. The numbers involved are minuscule. You're not going to threaten China with 100,000 guys in Shanghai, much less threaten the entire
with 40 AAVs, you could stuff in 20 Marines and you've got 800 people. That would last about 30 seconds. But this is something you need, and this is, I would suggest, it's getting wrapped around the axle. Is the expression we used about you wish you had, and HADR does matter. I would not belittle this. If this region was as placid as Bermuda, Japan would still want the capability. If it does want to defend its territory, and that does mean potentially take it back, you want to have everything you can possibly use. Collective self-defense. If you want to undercut the complaint that the Japanese are relying too much on the Americans to do the dying, you better at least fight on behalf of the Americans. Japan is it can make its own decisions about where it wants to get involved. They can do it on a case-by-case basis, just as every country does that. So it's hard to foresee exactly how else they might use it. One can think of some possibilities.
How would you use it if you are in charge?
I would focus on the Americans, and then naturally you will have some countries join in. The Australians come to mind. Then gradually work out, but you want to have it with the Americans first. and then you undercut that argument that Japan isn't doing enough on its own. That would be my approach.
Siegfried in freelancer from Germany. You praise the capability of the JSDF to doing complicated operations. Can you compare with the Chinese military doing complicated operations? Can you compare with Japan?
Probably it'd be hard to do. You would have to know that for what Japan needs to do, it's shown in very short time a reasonably good capability, but it needs to do much more. It needs to get much better. Like a sports team, once you've mastered the basics, you got to keep getting better. The Chinese, for what they need to do, are pretty good. For in certain conditions, I would say if they are amphibious capability, they could probably occupy any piece of territory in sort of the East or South China Sea that they wanted to. Taiwan would be harder, but if there's a small thing, they could go anywhere they want. Staying there would be difficult in certain circumstances. And I hate to say it, but the Chinese have a pretty good Marine Corps, which has gone sort of developed without people paying much attention. But they're getting better and better, and one doesn't underestimate them, but you don't overestimate them. But so it's a little hard to compare. You have to look at what needs done, and you often only have to be good enough, as the Argentinians showed in the Falklands. You just got to be good enough to do one thing, and so it's the Japanese have to keep getting better. The Chinese are pretty good. Depends on how they would be used or what might happen, and if we're in the mix. As I said, with us, Japan's got a much better chance, and with Japan, the U.S. has a much better chance of success.
Just a quick comment and then a kind of a wild question. On the question of money, Japan today spends 125 trillion yen on welfare. This is aggregate government, consolidated basis. 60 on pensions, 40 on medical, 10 plus or so on nursing care, 10 plus or so on support for families. 125 trillion yen. So if we're talking about raising the defense budget by, a trillion yen, that's, chump change. It could be easily found through simple efficiency gains in the welfare system. So just to back up your point that it's not really about money, it's about the will of the politicians to make choices about efficiency in the welfare system and transfer some of the money to other things. Now, the second question is kind of a crazy question, I guess, but how do you think events in the Crimea are affecting Japan's sense of what it needs to do to defend itself and the U.S.-Japan relationship?
I would imagine the Crimea has got Japan scared witless, and rightly so. You look at what the response to what the Russians have done, what the response is and what is going to be, and I'm not too optimistic. And certainly the Chinese note this as well. You've seen what they've done. Just start with Scarborough Shoal, declaring the 80s, James Shoal down by Malaysia, Second Thomas Shoal. This is not getting better. And when there is seen as a lack of will to resist, that you do tend to get a response. And this is a lesson pretty much learned at 5 years old in the playground. If you can protect yourself, you're not going to get bullied. If you can't, you will. And vacuums get filled. And so this is a pretty unsettling time. And I made the reference to the 30s and how well appeasement works. And this is dicier time than I can think of out here since, at least that I can remember.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture. And I'm Hiroshi Meguro from Institute of Okinawan Studies at Osaka University. And I have a couple of questions. One of them is about joint exercises. And the main objective is preparing for joint operations or training Japanese defense forces. That's the first question. And the second question is about the U.S. Marines. And one local newspaper in Okinawa reported recently that General Amos, the head of the Marine Corps, said that it's becoming more and more difficult to deploy Marines overseas, and so probably pre-positioning is more important in the future. And so what it means that moving back some core groups, the Marines from Okinawa to the United States or somewhere else, or I don't know exactly what he said, but what do you think of that kind of idea? And some people say that you don't need Marines in Okinawa anymore. And yeah, it's related to that kind of statement. Thank you.
Okay, when you do joint operations, it's for training. There's two purposes. One is to actually get used to operating together, which you may have to do in wartime. The other is to also train, in certain cases, to give the Japanese more experience at doing certain things. Once again, think of a sports team that has to constantly train and practice what it does. So there's two reasons for that. As for the Marines, you can never have enough of them, and you can never have them in too few places. But no, there will always be Marines forward deployed, based overseas. You look at our configuration, and we've moved all over the places over the years. We've been kicked out of all sorts of places, and we're there because there's a need for us. If there wasn't, we wouldn't be there. People don't want us there. All they have to do is say is go home, and we'll go home. But currently they want us. But as far as where they end up, it's hard to say. But I think there will definitely be there. There is a need for them on Okinawa. Obviously, that is a debate which just goes on forever. Some people will not be convinced. The people who do understand the importance of them, I would submit, are the Chinese. And ask them, and they would certainly say, please take them away. But it's certainly a U.S.-Japan defense relationship that cannot withstand the presence of a relatively small number of well-behaved Marines on Okinawa. Isn't going to withstand the stress that comes of Americans being called on to die on behalf of Japan. Some might argue. But that is an issue that will be with us forever. But once again, you can never have enough Marines. That's the lesson. Yes.
I'm going to ask how much percentage the drone will take in the American military action from now on?
Drones, well, we're going to use them. They're going to use more of them. It's a wonderful tool. It solves that age-old problem of what's over the hill. And people have been trying to do this since humans existed. So there'll be more of them. There'll be better drones, but unfortunately our enemies will have them too. And I wouldn't care to fight an enemy that has drones and knows how to use them.
How much percentage will it take in the American military action, maybe from now on?
Oh, I don't know. It won't be. It's still, the warfare doesn't change. This is just one tool that makes it easier, makes it more effective. But when the other side has it, you'd rather be in Bermuda somewhere. But it's be more and more. But warfare doesn't change. It's just as one help, and it helps you. Sorry. Actually, yeah.
Nishimura with Hokkaido Shimbun newspaper. Nishimura with Hokkaido Shimbun newspaper. One typical talking point on collective self-defense in Japan is whether Japan can retaliate to the enemy, which is attacking American vessel, cruising along with Japanese vessel. Is there any actual discussion inside U.S. forces with such kind of actual operation? And how Japanese forces helpful for United States force in that case? That's question number one. And number two is, how do you estimate the balance between the benefit that Japan can retaliate to the enemy, protecting the United States, and the negative impact on neighbor countries, which has a growing concern about such kind of right-wing tendency in Japan.
The first question, the answer, I just don't know. I'm not involved in that sort of a excessively detailed debate over when you can do what or when you can't. In terms of the Japan defending the Americans in a scenario you described, as I noted, that would be a good thing. It would get you immense political benefits in America, a lot of goodwill, and I think most of the region would actually say, thank you, Japan, for getting in there. The last point you had, in terms of the idea of militarism sweeping Japan, and I just don't see it. I apparently slept through that class somewhere, but I just don't see it. That there certainly are militaristic people, but I don't see this being a return to the 30s. And unfortunately, you find on the American side, in certain parts of the government and the military, there is this belief that Japan is either becoming militaristic or is just one step away from it. And I've been here a good long while, and I just don't see it. I don't. And once again, that concern seems to be more up in Northern Asia. The Indians don't give two hoots. The Indonesians as well. And once again, you go down the list, and there doesn't seem to be a huge concern about that. And even some countries that, surprisingly, are letting bygones be bygones. So it's sometimes helpful to break Asia down into the places where the concern is most felt.
Isabel Reynolds from Bloomberg. I was wondering if you had a view on the discussions about loosening restrictions on weapons exports from Japan. Would that make any difference to the budget issues, for example?
It would be helpful to relax the exports, and we're a couple of guys here who really know that. But yes, generally it would be useful. You'd get cheaper stuff, but you would also get better stuff, because you can get this, you can share technology. Joint development's an excellent way to do things. I wish we would develop the next AAV, that amphibious vehicle, with the Japanese, because we failed so badly the first time. It'd be nice to get the Japanese technology and our know-how together. So I think in general it's a good thing. How it will play out, I don't know. I had a guy tell me in confidence that they were going to relax the restrictions like a week from when he told me. This was 1995. I don't know. It will make a difference. It's not. It's one of those things. It's not. I don't know how much significance there is. It's a good thing, but is it going to change a whole lot? I'm not sure. But it could be good.
I'd just like to know why I heard 76% of military bases are put in such a little island of Okinawa. How did it end up being like that? Is that America's fault or Japanese fault?
Everything's America's fault. There's someone who knows the history could explain exactly how it ended up, but ultimately it's like in real estate, location, location, location. If Okinawa were to float 1,000 miles up to the northeast, it probably had no bases. But it is in key terrain, and you're naturally going to have bases there, a lot of them. And the whole Okinawa question, you will see that I didn't even touch on it tonight. I could have, but it's a distraction. It's a distraction, I'll leave it at that. But I do admire the Okinawan ruling class for the amount of money they are able to squeeze out of the central government, which is breathtaking. But ultimately, I'm not trying to be funny, but it's location. And It's just and location and history, and so that's how it is, and we'll see. But I don't know whose fault it is. There's probably 15 people who could each have claimed some share of it, would be my guess.
Any other questions? I have a few questions too. So, everybody raise your hand. I want to know. You mentioned, and I agree with you, that you mentioned, I agree with you, that Japan has a very low rate of militarism, however you define it. But I think one issue is that Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. The Prime Minister seems to have an opposite policy. He has talked very harshly. I mean, you read some of the statements, or statements by people who are clearly his friends, whom he's known to support, and you get the impression that that Godzilla is on the march. And then you look at the budget. If you compare, I did a comparison looking at Europe in the late 70s, so after essentially 10 years of détente, West Germany was probably doing 3 times more relative to GDP than Japan is today, and Italy, which had a GDP per capita which was much lower than Japan relative to the US, was probably doing 50% more than what Japan is today. So isn't part of the problem that image management has been extremely bad under the Abe cabinet?
Yes, I had a retired foreign reporter back when the word meant something. Tell me, it wasn't long ago, he said, if I said who he was, a lot of you would know who he is. But he said, of all the people that I came across, the Japanese were the worst at explaining themselves. And the image management has been terrible. You would think in Washington, D.C. that, the Tojo himself and his employees have come back. And it really has been terrible. It's not been very good. And Japan has a great story to tell, but it tells it so poorly, which is unfortunate. I would say MOFA simply hires the wrong advisors, whoever they hire. I knew someone had been offended, so I had to get them before they go. But they need to do better. The amounts of money, you say that Abe's just, unless he spends the money, ultimately he's not serious. Well, I say he might be, but Japan, the GOJ is not serious, unfortunately, would be my conclusion. It's worth remembering, I think, that, as I understand it, Abe does not just snap his fingers and have things happen. And there is a tendency to think that he's the guy that, that just gives orders and they get done. He's really got some obstruction around him to get things done. And this is, once again, part of the dynamic that is not well understood outside outside of Nagata-cho, perhaps, but certainly from overseas, it's not well understood.
Besides the finance ministry, who would you say are the obstructionists? Who would you name and shame?
I could name a couple names, but I won't. But there's something called the Kokubozoku. And these are guys that, they're sort of these elite guys who've been in bureaucracy and some politicians, and they're academics, they're defense experts, and they know nothing about defense. I'm not overstating this. These are guys, and I've had the misfortune of having sit next to one at dinner not too long ago. And a couple of things. These are people. His belief was, well, Japan doesn't need a JSDF. Leave everything up to the Navy or to the Air Force. That's all you need. A monkey could look at the defense requirements for a country like Japan and would realize that that is not all you need. You hear this in the United States from our equivalent of Kokubozoku. These people who've gotten their ideas from TV and movies that those smart bombs, you don't need anything but smart bombs. And these people have undue influence. And you saw this scramble when the NSC got formed here, of these guys elbowing their way to the front, trying to be the NSC guy. If they're the ones giving advice to Japan, God help them. I do have, and I've also heard these guys belittle both the uniformed military as stupid and as Ministry of Defense civilians as stupid. I mean, not even worth listening to. And it's said with such self-righteous certainty that you cringe when you hear it. And so those are people I would suggest are not playing a helpful role in Japan's defense. And it's human nature. The ancient Grecians probably wrote plays about this sort of thing, so it's nothing new.
Is there any questions? I don't want to monopolize the mic. Okay, so it is. Oh, you actually.
Thank you very much for your speech tonight. As a former Marine myself, are there any plans, like you said, kind of leadership, as far as kind of like acting like children and trying to create that, kind of synergy, I guess, between them? Would you expect maybe trying to use exercises for, like similar to Cobra Gold or something, and conducting exercises such as that in Okinawa or maybe here, kind of like every year you conduct Cobra Gold? Would you think that would be something that we should do? More exercises?
Oh yeah, more exercises are good. It depends on also what kind you do. For example, you have a Yamasakura exercise, which has been taking place since probably Edo Jidai, and a long while. And maybe if the Russians come, it's a great exercise. But it's lately, though, it's gotten better. They put in an amphibious angle. But where you have a really good, it depends on how you're training and what you're doing. And that's why a Dawn Blitz exercise was so valuable, because you're training a new necessary capability in somewhere else. You had to go get there, and that's hard enough in its own right. But Guam, Tinian, Saipan, Northern Marianas is a great opportunity for the JSDF and the Americans to train initially. And you could do multilateral training. So once Japan eventually works its way into that, it's a perfect location for it. It's close, doesn't cost much. It's U.S. territory. It's in the region, so you're not so far away nobody notices it. And you're right that gradually you can bring together, you say gradually, you bring together different countries, and you can use your imagination and make it a valuable exercise. So lots of opportunity there if we take advantage. But JSDF really doesn't have money to do things that we would even well, not even us. We have Tully's Coffee at Kandahar Air Base, and, but they really don't have money. Go to a JSDF base. It's actually kind of sad how tattered it is in some places. You really, these are, I have a particular affinity for the JSDF, but they just don't have the money and the kind of training that we would do. They just often can't do it. We would invite guys to come and see our, how we do amphibious planning. And say, look, we just don't have money for a ticket. And, they don't. And so, they need to find it, Japan is grotesquely overbuilt in terms of airstrips or airport. Doesn't need any more. The money's there, they've got to get it. But lots of opportunity for training. Particularly down in Guam would be the ideal place to do it. Okinawa will always be a little tough. Partly the geography isn't quite as good, but you can do more down there.
Well, thank you very much. We're extremely grateful to you. As you know, we are a very poor university. We are not supported by the Japanese government, and like all other private universities in Japan, because I guess we're considered part of the alien invasion. So we can't offer much to our speakers, but we can offer you a calendar with drawings, I was going to say by our inmates, no, by our students. So thank you very much. We're very grateful.